First, I thank Peter again. I've already introduced myself. Hall Gardner, been professor and former chair of the internet. Well, it's called the International Comparative Politics Department before. And I really think Peter's doing something that's important, really a revolutionary thinking about our democratic process and how to make it more democratic. And I really think this is the kind of move we're being challenged by the authoritarians. I'll put it that way. Look at Trump. Trump's one of his appeals is he challenges the democratic process, but in a way that moves us towards authoritarianism. And that's one of Peter's themes. And so we're seeing that in the United States, and we need to move the opposite way towards a real democratic vision. And I really think Peter's moving us in that direction. So that's my first point. Second point is I met Peter in Belfast as one of my many trips that I've taken my students on, from NATO, the EU, to Doha, Qatar, to Tbilisi, to Moscow. I've done a number of voyages every semester, Geneva, taking them to different think tanks. Usually I like to go to think tanks. And to do a lot of tourism at the same time, because I find that very educational. Anyway, the point is that I met Peter on the trip to Belfast. He gave us an excellent introduction to the conflict in Northern Ireland. And so what was really moving about that particular field trip was the fact that our guides were former prisoners for on either the Catholic or Protestant side, depending on which group they had associated with. The ones I met admitted to gun running. They were young people basically moving guns from one side of town to another. But some of them hinted about doing other things, which I never found out what they were. But I do know that at least one of them said, if I go too close to the Catholic side, they'll kill me. So he literally left us several blocks away from the border line, the wall that I guess still comes down at 10 o'clock. I don't know if it still does anymore, but I believe they open up in the daytime and then things are closed in the evening. The wall is closed between the Catholic and Protestant side. So anyway, to no further ado, I want to say that I also, those of you who don't know, my gigantic opus here, Ashgate Research Companion, The War, Origins, and Prevention. Peter has an excellent article, chapter in this on the topic he's going to talk about today, and how majority rule actually can wind us up into conflicts. Well, no further ado, let Peter take over here.
Thank you very much, Hall, and thank you for organizing this event today, not only the administrative side, but also the technical side. And as you know, we have had a few problems together. But anyway, everything is working.
Well, let me say, that we did have, I really apologize. It seems like we still have some more, though we do have some guests. We still have some guests that haven't gone. But I forgot one more thing, is that this is also co-sponsored by the Center for Critical Democracy Studies, headed by Steve Sawyer, who founded that group, and it publishes the review de Tocqueville studies. So I have to give a word in for Professor Sawyer for helping sponsor this. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I'm talking about decision making, and many years ago, it was all done by force. And men were stronger than women, and stronger men were stronger than weaker ones. And well, gradually the situation changed, and then people started talking. And not only talking, but in Europe and China, they started voting, but not in Africa. And in Africa, they continued to talk. And this is part of their traditional way of doing things. They do not take majority votes, or they didn't in the old days, and they would rely on a verbal consensus. And the difference between the two methodologies, the one used in Africa and the one used in the rest of the world, is that with a verbal process, an entirely verbal process, you can actually achieve a consensus sometimes. And it might take a long time. You might have to, okay, can't do it today, so come back tomorrow and try again. But in theory, sometimes you can do it. With majority voting, you cannot. Majority vote is by definition, it measures so many votes in favor and so many against. It measures the level of dissent. It is not measuring consensus. So today I'm talking about decision-making, voting systems used in decision-making. And first of all, we'll look at binary voting and the problems that it has created. Then we will look at the theory of voting, because there are other ways of doing things, as we shall see. And then finally, I'll talk about the benefits of consensus voting, which includes power sharing. Nearly every country likes to aspire to be democratic. And in Europe, we have the German Democratic Republic. And in Asia, they have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And basically what happens is that the party in power, the only party, chooses the candidate, the only candidate, and the people then vote candidate X, yes or no. And that's not very good, is it? And we in the West, well, we call ourselves democratic, and we have elections and parliaments, and we have even the occasional referendums. And what happens is that the party or coalition in power, I'm talking about decision-making now, not elections, the party or coalition in power chooses the option, and as often as not, it is the only option, and the people or members of parliament then vote option X, yes or no, which is not much better than North Korea. And sometimes we have option X or option Y, which is a little bit better. And as we shall see, we can occasionally, countries have multi-option referendums and multi-option votes. Now, voting is used in elections as well as in decision-making. So let's have a brief look at elections, just by way of introducing the theme of decision-making. And they vary from binary, which is not very good, to PR, which is proportional representation, which is pretty good. And the choice of electoral system, has a huge impact on the politics of the country concerned. And if you have just what we described for North Korea, you have, well, it's a one-party state. And if you have first past the post, like in England or the United States, then you tend to have two big parties, or as with the Ivory Coast, we have one big party, one dominant party as it's called. And if you go to PR, like in Algeria and Norway, then you have lots of parties. And jolly good, and why not? And if you have a mixture of the two, the German system, which is half first past the post and half PR, then you finish up with two big parties and a couple of little ones. So the impact, as I say, is huge. But the far greater impact on the politics of the country concerned is the decision-making process. And here too, you have lots of ways of doing things. And they vary from not very good to the good and so on. And you start off with binary voting, which is not very good. And you can have plurality voting or two-round voting or other systems as well, as we shall see. But nearly everybody is using binary voting. And this applies to democracies as well as one-party states. And it really is extraordinary that we have this sort of blind spot. And people will talk about elections, but they won't talk about decision-making. The other consequence is the party structures that emerge. And in the one-party state, well, most people outside those countries will refer to them as non-democratic. And of the other ones, which may be democratic, I'm not sure if Russia qualifies, or even the United States for that matter. And there is the possibility of a multi-party state, or you can have, as in Switzerland, an all-party coalition. Well, there's another way of doing things. We also have what are called donor democracies. And there is an extraordinary idea in the West that what we do in the West is what everybody should do, whether they like it or not. Whereas in the Ivory Coast, and I mention the Ivory Coast because one of the audience is from there, we think, and they have 76 members of their parliament are independent. And it's a similar situation in Afghanistan or the Democratic Republic of Congo and so on. So to think that our Western idea is just fantastic is a bit naive, to put it mildly. But in Africa, we have donor democracies, and these are the countries which accept the Western way of doing things, because that means they then get Western financial support. But we may ask, at least in retrospect, whether it was wise to give majority rule to Rwanda. Democracy first started in Greece, as we all know. And basically what happened is that the men, only rich men, I'm afraid, but they went down to the forum and they debated issues of the day and they took majority votes, and there were no political parties in those days, and the system worked fairly well. And the men would take the decision and the executive would then execute. And democracy was also used in China, again for rich men only, very rich men actually. They were all ministers in the imperial court of the former Han dynasty. Again, this is over 2,000 years ago. And history relates that the emperor usually went along with whatever the majority decision of his ministers. But maybe majority voting is not quite the most brilliant way of doing things. And this became clear in Rome, in a court of law, where the accused was charged with murder. And the jury had three options on the table, A, B, and C: acquittal, punishment, and capital punishment. And Pliny the Younger realized that if you have a binary vote on execute, yes or no, then, oh dear, the A and B folks will join forces and vote against C. And if somebody else says, well, why don't we release him? Then the B and C will gang up against A, and so on. And if there's no majority in favor of any one option, then logically there is a majority against every option. So, needless to say, I hope, over the years, there have been quite a few scientists and other intellectuals who have suggested a more scientific way of doing things. And we had Ramon Llull in Spain or Catalonia, depending on your point of view, or both. And he spoke about preferential voting, and that was 1199. A few years later, Cardinal Nicholas Cusanos, and he actually advocated a point system. And then a few years later, again in France, in l'Académie des Sciences, and Jean-Charles de Borda did the mathematics. And we sometimes forget, or didn't know, that in days gone by, people spoke about decision making in rather more detail than we do today. And this was Le Marquis de Condorcet, and he was saying, well, it's not just what people think that matter, it's how you sort it out. It's the methodology that you use which is so important. And what Jean-Charles de Borda suggested was the point system. So if you have a ballot of n options, then the voter can cast m preferences, and then points are awarded to first, second, and third preferences according to the rule m minus 1 to 1. So if you vote for only one preference, then your favorite gets 1 point. And if you vote for two, then your favorite gets 2 points and your second preference gets 1 point, and so on. And if you vote for all n preferences, then your favorite gets n points. And your second choice gets n minus 1, and so on. And that was the idea. Unfortunately, even in his lifetime, this was changed to n-1.
Mm.
And so if you cast only one preference and you get n points, that gives you an n point advantage over all the other options. So the incentive was to vote for only n. So if you use the n-1 rule, then the incentive is to cast your other preferences, to state not only your favorite option, but also your compromise option or options. And it's a much more inclusive system, whereas the n-1 is not inclusive at all. It becomes little more than a plurality vote, I'm afraid. Meanwhile, in France at that time, things were happening. I mean, in 1789, there was the revolution, of course. But l'Académie des Sciences, they thought about the border system and the Condorcet system, which I'll explain later on. And they adopted the border count, and it worked fairly well, except people then started truncating because of that n-1 rule. And then with the revolution, and l'Académie des Sciences became l'Institut Français, and there was a new president, and he didn't like this consensus nonsense very much. And he said, no, come on, let's go back to majority voting. And I'm afraid since, well, you might know of this guy. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And since then, nearly everybody all over the world actually has been obeying the instructions of the now deceased dictator. And as I said earlier, we talk about electoral systems, but we do not talk about decision making. A few years ago, in the French Green Party, they were taking decisions by majority vote, because that's what happens in most political parties. And somebody who is now a friend started Googling and found the De Border Institute. So to cut a long story short, I then went to France, to Coutances, and spoke to a whole load of French people about a Frenchman they'd never heard of, Jean-Charles de Border. But as I say, people, yeah, they talk about electoral systems, but they do not talk about decision making. So in Germany in 1949, after the war, and in South Africa after apartheid, and in Bosnia after the war there, and in Belfast during the peace agreements negotiations of 1998, and in Europe where we had the Convention on the Future of Europe, people talk about elections sometimes, but they don't talk about decision making. They might tweak it a little, but they don't look at multi-option voting. They confine themselves to majority voting. So in the EU, we now have qualified majority voting. Oh, jolly good. That means small countries like Malta can still have an influence. And in Germany, we have constructive votes of no confidence. So if you don't like Chancellor A, then don't just say no and vote no. Be positive and suggest, well, Chancellor B. Oh. And that's a lesson from Weimar, of course. And then in Bosnia and Belgium and conflict zones, we have what they call consociational voting. So instead of one majority, you need two majorities, both Catholics and Protestants, or both Greek Turks, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, and so on. But it perpetuates the very sectarianism which was the problem. And it gives one side, well, it gives both sides the power of veto, and it's not the best. But there is, as I say, there is this obsession with majority voting, and even to the stage when they were writing the basic law in Germany, the Grundgesetz, this is 1949 again, and this is in the introduction, and it's mathematical nonsense. They're saying the whole equals a fraction, and it's, as I say, it's mathematical nonsense. But it's everywhere. it's all over the place. So a couple of years ago, I folded up my little bicycle and put it on the train and travelled overland from Belfast down through the Balkans and the Caucasus, which are two conflict zones that I know quite well, and then into China, into Xinjiang, and then into eastern China, all over eastern China, down to Hong Kong, Taiwan, a few days in North Korea, and then back on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow, which is where I start. Because in 1985, Gorbachev came to power, and that was the end of the Cold War, and this was brilliant news. But the basic premise of Western diplomacy is that we in the West know, well, everything actually, which means that other people in Africa and Asia don't know very much. So we have to go and tell them what to do. So lots of experts went to Moscow, and some spoke about democratization. And some of these experts were monolingual experts, which I think is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but never mind. And they said to Gorbachev and so on, well, basically what you need, you have elections, and then you get a parliament, and then the executive proposes legislation, and then the parliament will debate this, and they'll argue all day, maybe, but eventually they take a majority vote. And if you get a majority, then that legislation can be put into law. And this system of democracy is called majoritarianism. So basically we were saying, Mr. Gorbachev, you need majoritarianism. But he doesn't speak English. So we had to translate into Russian. And so we said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, вам нужен. And the Russian word for majoritarianism, as some in the audience might know, is Bolshevism. So we were telling Gorbachev to be a little Bolshevik. And we're all little Bolsheviks, I'm afraid, all over the place, despite the huge number of problems that this causes. Northern Ireland, I mean, it was majority rule was the problem, still is. And it was based on anti-Catholic. Hitler was anti-Jew. He came to power democratically. Stalin was anti-Kulak. Well, Lenin as well. And that was, well, it led to the deaths of up to 24 million people in the gulags. Algeria, the civil war in Algeria was partly caused by this fear that the Muslim Brotherhood might win the election and gain 100% of the power. Again, it's majority rule. And so hence the horrible civil war. In the Balkans, everybody was anti-everybody else. All the wars in the former Yugoslavia started with a referendum. And that's a quote from Oslobodjenie, which is the Sarajevo newspaper. In the Ivory Coast, we had two civil wars, and again initiated it as a result of the elections. And in China, well, maybe the worst example in the world of binary politics, this idea that you anti somebody, was the anti-rightist campaign of 1960. And it's worst not because Chinese are worse than anybody else, but because China is more populous. But it was part of the Great Leap Forward in 1960, and it led to the famine and the deaths of up to 40 million people. And the Chinese Communist Party uses majority voting. And in 1989, thousands of students in Tiananmen Square and the Politburo Standing Committee took a majority vote. Military intervention, yes or no? As if there were only two options. And it passed by a margin of one vote. This happens all over the place. Politicians, you can hear them in America, you hear them in Europe, you hear them in Britain, all over the place. And they say, no, you have a choice. It's this or that. It's black or white. It's yes or no. They don't talk about the gray. They don't want to. They're in the business of winning. That's what they want to do. And so they argue as if that's the way it has to be done. But in a pluralist democracy, I would argue, by definition, a controversy is never binary. Never. Well, almost never. And maybe there is one question in politics which is actually binary, and that is, which side of the road should we drive on? And there's only one country that has ever had a referendum on this problem, and that was Sweden in 1955, where they had not two, but three options on the ballot paper. Oh, jolly good. And so, basically, so left or right or blank. So if you were the committed Democrat and you wanted to participate in democracy because it's a social thing and that's what everybody should do, but on this particular question you are indifferent, then you can vote blank and, as it were, go with the flow. So I'm suggesting that problems aren't binary, but even if they are, if you can find one that is binary, even then the ballot should not be binary. Never. Not if it's a problem. Majority rule, of course, is fine. We don't want minority dictators, and we know we're not going to get unanimity. But majority voting is not fine. You cannot, actually, you cannot identify a majority opinion in a majority vote because it has to be identified earlier if it's going to be already on the ballot paper. You might be able to ratify, maybe, but you can't identify. Now, you could possibly identify in a multi-option vote, maybe, and with preferential voting, there's even greater possibilities. But I'm afraid politicians like majority voting because they can choose the question, and in most instances, the question is then the answer. So we have what we might call democratic dictators, and these guys, they're all guys, of course, have used majority voting. And I must confess, we have to apologize here because the first dictator to dictate properly and get 100% was this fella here, who's an Irishman, Bernardo O'Higgins. Yeah. And I'm not sure how he got to Chile, but he got 100% and became El Supremo in 1818. Now, in democracies, you can have dictatorial democrats. When New Zealand voted on their electoral system, and they had a debate in 1992, and they set up a commission, and it had submissions and had hearings, and people could say whatever they wanted to say. And their task was to draw up a shortlist. You can't have a ballot with over 300 electoral systems on it, because that's the number that there are. But they drew up a short list of these five. So you had first past the post, which is not very good, and then PRSTV, which is very good, and then three sort of ones in the middle. And they had a vote. People could choose whatever they wanted, and the German system we mentioned, half first past the post and half PR, that did very well. So there was then a second round, and sure enough, it won on 54%. When Slovenia had their debate on their electoral system, they had three options on the table. And they took three majority votes, which is not the best way of doing things, but never mind. And one option got, well, nothing got a majority, but one option got 49%, which was much more than the other two. So they said, oh, okay, well, let's go along with that. But in the UK, mother of democracy, so-called, grumpy old grandpa, if you ask me, and they had their debate in 2011. David Cameron doesn't like PR, so he said, he dictated that it will be between AV, alternative vote, and first past the post, and 68%. But whether or not it was the will of the people, well, we just don't know. So let's have a look at multi-option voting. And because the ancient Greeks, they knew this statement from Pliny the Younger, that if there is no majority in favor of any one thing, then you've got a majority against everything. So you have to have some sort of order to do things. Otherwise, it becomes a bit of a lottery. And for some extraordinary reason, I mean, this is Pliny the Younger writing nearly 2,000 years ago, and he was saying in ancient times. So that's an awful long time ago. It's about 2,500 years. For some extraordinary reason, this is the methodology that we're still using today. Pretty well. So if you take a hypothetical example, and I've just chosen 3 individuals, Miss I, Mr. J, and Miss K, a committee of 3, and they are debating this tax rates for the rich. And let's assume that it's currently at 40%. And they all agree this is far too low. I mean, crazy. I mean, okay. So Miss I says 70%. And Mr. J, steady on, a bit much, isn't it? So he proposes an amendment of 60%. And Miss K, well, she was even more modest of 50%. So why not pluralism? Let's everybody have whatever ideas they want. And let's assume that they have these preferences. So if your first preference is 70, then of the other options, then your second preference will probably be 60 and your third preference 50. And it has that sort of logic to it. But what happens is that if we follow those rules of the ancient Greeks, the first thing that you do is you choose which amendment you want. So we have the 2 amendments, Mr. J's first preference of 60, Miss K's first preference of 50. So we have a vote between these 2. That's a straightforward binary choice. There's no problem here. And the first 2 people both prefer 60 to 50. So, okay, it's 60. So that's the preferred amendment. Now, do we use it or do we not? That's a straightforward binary choice. So it's 60 versus 70, which is the motion itself. The first person and the third person, they both prefer 70 to 60. So the answer is 70. And this is called the substantive. And the final part of the democratic process is the vote between the substantive and the status quo, which is 70 versus 40, of course. And these 2 people here both prefer 40, so the answer is 40. Mm-hmm. So they agreed that 40 is much too low. And then when they start using binary voting, they agree that they disagree. I mean, they disagree that they agree. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. But if you're a Democrat, you don't argue about this 40 because it was passed by a 2/3 majority. And who could possibly argue against a 2/3 majority? Well, everybody could actually, because look, all 3 people prefer 50 to 40. All 3 of them, 100% want 50 more than 40. And yet this binary process has produced 40. So binary voting is not only divisive and primitive and adversarial and blunt, and it's also sometimes wrong. It produces a result which is fake, to coin a phrase, sometimes. And if we look a little bit more closely at this voter's profile, we see that 70 is more popular than 60, which we write as that sort of greater than sign. And 60 is more popular than 50, and 50 is more popular than 40, and 40 is more popular than 70, and you go round and round in circles forever. It's called a cycle. It was first noted by Le Marquis de Condorcet, and it basically means that no matter what devious process some dubious politician or dubious process some devious politician has concocted, there will always be a majority in favor of something else, where you have the paradox. And countless examples in real life about this. So let's have a look at multi-option voting. Surely there must be a better way of doing things. You could have a plurality vote, and you have lots of options, and people just choose one of them. But you might not get a majority in that case. You might only get the largest minority. So that's not very good. With the 2-round system, then you definitely get a majority opinion. Well, usually. And you take the two leading options from the first round plurality vote, nothing gets a majority. However, second round majority vote, and then, yes, you've got a majority. And whether it's the right majority or not is debatable, but never mind. Approval voting is a bit, well, I call it fluffy. You vote for something if you think it is brilliant, or if you think it's pretty good, or if you think it's all right. So it's a fairly inaccurate measure, and some people will vote for things that they think are brilliant, and other people will vote for more than just their brilliant options. And there are different ways of analyzing it as well, so it can be very fluffy. And whether it's a majority opinion or not is debatable. With range voting, it's almost impossible to know. Range voting, sorry, is when you get, everybody gets so many points, say 10 points to allocate. So the intransigent tends to plonk all 10 points onto his favorite, whereas the more consensual voter might give 4, 3, 2, 1 to her 4 top options. So it's a bit unfair on the more consensual person. The alternative vote is what we mentioned earlier, and it's a knockout system. You have lots of plurality votes until something has a majority, and you have the first plurality vote. If nothing gets a majority, then you knock out the smallest one, and you transfer its votes to its second preference, and this process goes on until something does get a majority, usually. And the other two methodologies are the modified border count and the Condorcet rule, which we will look at in a moment. And they are both definitely give you a majority opinion sometimes. So let's take an example as a slightly more complex example this time of 15 people, 15 voters talking about 4 options. And 15, well, that's the number that you have in the UN Security Council. And for some funny reason, they still use majority voting. But let's take a very hypothetical but controversial example, because these 6 people, their preferences are A, D, C, B, which is the exact opposite of these 4 people who's, oh dear, what has happened there? Oh. I've lost my PowerPoint, folks. I'm going to have to.
We
I
see
don't know what I do now. Oh, I've gone. Oh, here we are. Open share tray, and here it is. And we're back in business. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, sorry.
So yes, these 6 people have preferences A, D, C, B. These 4 people have the exact opposite, B, C, D, A. And these 5 people don't like either A or B, and they have their own ideas. So if we look at this voter's profile, we see that option A is very divisive. 6 people think it's the best. 9 people think it is the worst. So yes, it's very divisive. B is not much better, to be quite honest. And so maybe the consensus opinion is best represented by C or D. Well, let's have a look. And, oh, now it's not going to. Oh, I've now lost my ability. Oh, here we are.
Right there.
So in a plurality vote, you just have a look at the first preferences. So sure enough, the answer is A, and that is the social choice. A is the winner. In a 2-round vote, you take the 2 leading options from the first round, from the plurality vote, which is A and B. And if everybody's preferences stay the same, then your second round majority vote will be B9, A6, and B, a score of 9 is a majority. In the alternative vote, you start with that plurality vote again, and option D is obviously not very good. It's only got 2 options, 2 votes for MSEC. So it is eliminated, and its 2 votes go to C. So the second round score is A6, B4, C5. Still nothing with the majority, so option B with only 4 is now eliminated, and those 4 votes also go to C, so the third round score is C9, A6, and 9 is a majority, as we already know. It's a different majority opinion from the 2-round vote, but oh well. And in the point system, modified border count, then first preference gets 4 points, second gets 3, third 2, add them all up, and the winner is now D. And with the other methodologies, approval voting, yeah, as I said, there are no preferences. Everything is an approval, depending on what you do, if you do anything at all. And if you count all the first and second preferences as approvals, then the answer is D. If you count the first, second, and third as approvals, then it's a draw between C and D. And of course, if you do things in a different way, then you might get a different answer. And it is, yes, altogether a bit fluffy. And range voting, as I say, it just encourages the intransigent to be even more so. And the other system, finally, the Condorcet, which I promised you, and it's a bit like a football league, actually. If you have 4 football teams, then maybe the best thing to do is to get them all to play each other and see which wins the most matches. So what we do with the Condorcet is everybody casts their preferences, and then we analyze in pairs. Is A more popular than B? Is A more popular than C? Is B more popular than D? And so on. You look at all the pairings, and in this case, option D wins the most, so D is the winner. And these 2 methodologies here, the modified border count and Condorcet, they are the only methodologies which always take all preferences cast by all voters into account. They are the most accurate. Not only that, they are pretty scientific. If you have a binary vote, then it's just A or B, and it's pretty blunt, really, and not very good. And if you have multi-option vote, then if you have 3 options, then you have 3 ways of voting, A, B, or C, which is a bit better. And if you have preferential voting, there are 6 ways of casting your preferences. You can have ABC, ACB, BAC, and so on. If you have 4 options, there are 24 ways. If you have 5 options, there are 120 different opinions and nuances that can be expressed. We are talking about a precision instrument. So basically, what happens is that if you have a consensual polity like this, that was based on the modified border count, for example, then if you have a problem, then okay, somebody will suggest an option A. And then a bit like what happens in a German constructive vote of confidence, if you don't like option A, then okay, that's all right, we'll suggest an alternative. And not an amendment of this little paragraph here or that clause there, which is to be resolved by a binary vote, but suggest a whole package. Be positive. Okay, you don't like option A, so put forward your proposal as option B. And if you have 6 parties in a parliament, then you might have 6 options on the table. And why not? Jolly good. And then you have your debate. And you can tweak things, you can change things, you can amend things. You can composite 2 of the options if you want to. You might even get to the stage where you delete one of the options. But nothing changes unless the proposer, the original proposer or proposers, agree to that change. So you have a completely different atmosphere from what normally happens in most political debates. And as the number of options on the table or computer screen or website changes, then you might finish up with only one option. Oh, jolly good. In which case, that's a verbal consensus, and we can all go home. But if not, then okay, never mind. The speaker can then draw up a shortlist of about 5 options, and the members of Parliament can then cast their preferences, and then the executive executes. That is their job, just as it was in ancient Greece. The consensual polity, it basically is based on the fact that the MBC, the modified border count, is non-majoritarian. It identifies the option with the highest average preference. And an average, of course, involves every voter, not just a majority of them. So no longer would we have to have this habit, or whatever you like to call it, of governments forming and then splitting into two. And we don't have this in committees in universities and business and elsewhere. You have a committee and then people work together, but not in politics. And you have these incredible arguments, sometimes lasting for days or weeks or months. And the record is more than a year in Belgium a few years ago, where the politicians are arguing about what they should do and how should they form a majority. So what should happen, I would argue, is that the people elect the parliament by preferential PR, ideally, and then parliament elects the government. Why not? Again, PR, of course. And so your cabinet, your parliament will represent the people and your cabinet will represent the parliament. And then parliament debates, if we're talking about non-urgent matters. The speaker draws up a ballot and parliament makes its decisions by MBC and the executive then executes. That's all. And if they don't like the decision of parliament, then they can resign. And the similar sort of process happens in referendums, a bit like that example of New Zealand that we spoke about. And the important thing in both scenarios is that the choice of decision, the choice of options, must be independent. It's part of the division of powers. It's so important. But as long as you have that independence, then you're talking about an all-inclusive government. The consequences could be considerable. In London, as some of you may know, we had the crazy situation. The British, they say they believe in fair play and cricket and stuff. But a couple of years ago, the Northern Ireland extremists, there are only 8 of them in a parliament of over 600. So it's just over 1%. And they were in government. And bigger parties, Liberal Democrats and Scottish Nationalists, and they weren't in government. And this is totally unfair, apart from anything else. And you have the situation where a tiny little bunch becomes the tail that wags the dog. And it's the same in Israel with Jewish Home. And they had not so long ago, they had a government which had a majority of only one, an extremist. So what a crazy way of doing things. And if you had all-party power sharing, then the Arabs in Israel could be in government. Wouldn't that be nice? And it's the same in Turkey. The Kurds could be in government. That'd be quite nice too. In Vienna, you had a couple of years ago the Freedom Party, and they're pretty extreme as well, I'm afraid. And they had more influence than is its proportional due. And the same was in Amsterdam a few years ago. And again, you had a majority, a government with a majority of only one. In Abidjan, you would have power sharing. So no need for a civil war, just work together. It is that win or lose idea of politics which is so dangerous. In Belfast, we could have power sharing. And the methodologies I'm talking about, the modified border count, is colorblind. You have a decision which is colorblind. It's not enforcing or enhancing the sectarian division. In Dublin and in Berlin, it would mean the extremist parties, Sinn Féin and the Alternative for Deutschland, would be in government. And I would argue there is nothing much to fear about this. In fact, there's lots to hope for. Because the elected politician usually likes to be re-elected. And you're not going to get re-elected if you're not effective. And the only way you can be effective in a consensus government is by moderating your extremism. That is the hope. That is democracy. In Washington, extraordinary thing that Barack Obama trying to get bipartisan politics when relying on a majority vote. I mean, it's just logically impossible. And what a pity that he didn't understand his Kenyan roots, because in Kenya it would be a baraza. And the word is almost untranslatable, same one we used at the beginning of this slideshow, but it would mean power sharing. But you're not going to get that in Washington until you change the decision-making process and not just the electoral process as well. So that's my talk, and I would just say that the whole business, the era that we are living in of climate change and COVID more directly, I suppose, they are telling us that we have to cooperate, that the human race will not survive unless it cooperates. And I would argue that consensus voting is therefore actually part of our survival. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was superb. Wow. still absorbing the importance. I really find this really crucial to our, as you said, building the consensus over all these issues and how the process itself really creates these artificial dichotomies when there are multiple options to choose from, and we're forced into these binary decisions, as you put it.